Thank you so much for attending. It is a real honor to be here and talk about, I think, a very important topic, and hopefully numerous topics, I think, because this is a strategic issue, that affects not only domestic politics, but international relations and human rights, etc. I work for a company called Very Good Security. That's not important. What is important, though, is half of our company's in Ukraine. So some of you also may have employees in Ukraine, and so then you know how difficult a time this has been and the questions that it raises for not only security, but really the very lives of your employees. So just this will suffice as a CV. I'm a pretty lucky cyber analyst. I was in Estonia in 2007 for the Russian cyber attack against the movement of a statue from Estonia's capital center. And I was in Ukraine in 2014. I taught a cybersecurity class at the university in Kiev and did a book for NATO on the cyber dimension of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, hence here as a speaker. And I also just happened to meet, when I was a student back in 1992, randomly in front of the White House, Boris Yeltsin, the person who put Vladimir Putin into power. So let's look a little bit about what is cyber war? Is it a thing or not? If you just look at the two bookends of this crisis, the first invasion in 2014 and the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia on this year, you can see how chaotic cyberspace is. And numerous events have taken place during that time that we would call cyber war, or what we think are the most powerful cyber attacks we have seen to date. The power grid attack on 2015 on Christmas, which was reiterated 1 year later. On 2016, you could also add the hack of the Democratic Party that helped lead to Donald Trump being in the White House. And that also has been attributed to the GRU, or Russian military intelligence, which makes you have to think, okay, how are they using hacking against politics in America, the Russian military? That makes you think that this is a national security issue for them, right? This is a military issue, politics in various regions of the world, and of course in Ukraine. And you probably know, but even Vladimir Putin has called Kiev the mother of all Russian cities, right? So why are they so interested? Okay, many things happening, but let's say that peacetime in cyberspace is a pretty chaotic environment with a lot going on. So about Ukraine war this year, I don't think the question really is about Ukraine. I don't even think it's about Russia. It's about Putin, right? It's about an old man trying to stay in power. And we have to face up to the facts. This is real. So people want better healthcare, they want better education, better infrastructure for the country. And that doesn't matter whether you're in Moscow or Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. So we can see here's pro-democracy protests in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, 2020, even this year in Kazakhstan, right? That governments put down through autocracy, and that includes computer network operations, right, of an internal kind meant to suppress dissent and to project power. So when I was living in Kiev in 2014 to 2017, I taught a class at the university in Kiev. And two of the chapters were written by Ukrainian government folks, and they covered the cyber attacks during the Euromaidan events of 2014. And here are just some of the things, and we're going to see them not only in 2014, but in 2022. Things like web defacements, then leading into denial of service, doxing, and more, depending on the temperature in the geopolitical space, right? So the cyber attacks or computer network operations tend to mirror what's happening in traditional space. So the closer you get to an election, the more malware you see. And this is true in Texas, as it is in Australia, as it is in Russia, right? So I spent 2.5 years recently for doing data science for a malware detection company. And geopolitics are absolutely a magnet for malware, no matter where you live, right? So that was a CERT UA chapter, and you can see the Russian military-specific attacks are more aggressive. So they're, taking over satellite, control centers, cutting cables physically, and then moving into the softer space, but stuff that does require more intelligence and more forethought, stuff like whitewashing Wikipedia, right, of information you don't like and inserting information in there, trying to, that supports your political program. And again, so I'll just mention that when I talk to my students in Kiev at university, I used to ask them occasionally, because we're talking about all these issues, I would say, do you feel like in your personal social media space that you sense the impact and the penetration of Kremlin propaganda? And every time, every hand would go up, right? So that's the power of information operations on the web as, even, students, admittedly, these are students at a nice university, but still, it's important that propaganda does work. It does reach. So this, I want to, first of all, my wife and I, we go on long walks. We live in Brazil now, and one of the things we were talking about just before the war was that this war is not going to go well for Russia. Ukraine is huge, and there's just basic geography will tell you that 150,000 troops was nowhere close to the number of people you would need to occupy such a large space. So in this case, in 2015, on the Christmas hack, here's what I want you to think about is the tanks and the troops are bogged down in the Donbass, which is, far eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Lugansk. Cyber attacks give you a different kind of tool, a different kind of weapon to reach far beyond the battlefield. So think about 2016 as well, the election attack in the United States, right? No troops or tanks were there, but yet it was a powerful testament to what you can do with hacking and doxing, right? So in this case, it was actually an attack on an electricity grid. The lights went out in Western Ukraine. It's not in the same physical space, and it's not even in the same logical space, right? It just affects civilians. But it's over on the Polish border, on the NATO border, right? So there's just a number of things to think about that sort of hacker tools and tactics, they give you another weapon, another kind of weapon that you can use in a different time and space. And of course, this is in between the two invasions. It gives you opportunity to attack silently in peacetime. I guess one more point here is that a lot of hacking, if you want to be ready for war, has to be done in peacetime, right? So that's one of the ironies. This, in international relations, they call it the security dilemma. The more I prepare for war, the more that's going to frighten my neighbors, right? And so in part, like what's happening in Germany right now, so Germany decided it's going to, triple its investment in military equipment, right, and troops, because of the changing dynamic in international relations. But that's going to have knock-on effects, right, in Holland and France and elsewhere. So it's inevitable, right, which is dangerous. So this is a reminder to us all that traditional power is not decisive, right? If you think traditional power in terms of I've got this many tanks, this many ships, etc., Ukraine is winning the Battle of the Black Sea with a grand total of 0 ships today, right? How is that possible? It's possible, Napoleon said the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, right? So saying that the defense has all kinds of advantages that the offense doesn't, I think even in cyberspace, I mean, you can set up honeypots, you can set up, tricks and traps that if you do them in a unique way, the attacker will really be fooled, I think. But all I want to say here is that you can have, the United States found this out in Afghanistan and in Vietnam and in Iraq, right? You can win every battle and still lose the war, and people have been learning that lesson forever. Cyber power is a bit different, right? It gives you a very elusive way to fight, right? We're talking information operations here. Information operations is a big topic, right? I think if we talk computer network operations, there's 3 basic kinds of attack, right, I can pull off. I can steal your information. In other words, I can read your email. I can deny you access to information. In other words, I can stop you from reading your email. Or most alarmingly, perhaps to you, I could change your email, right? I could say, don't meet your contact at midnight, but meet them at noon, right? And that's the most dangerous. But I do think that those are as you get across that spectrum, they get rarer, right? So above all, the internet is about collecting information, disseminating information, and as we're about to see, that is more important than the more exotic and esoteric attacks, which take so much time and effort and are likely to be of a temporary win type of nature. So here on this timeline, you can see the kinds of things that a military would do to prepare the battle space for victory, right? So strategic intelligence happens all the time, right? So Microsoft put out this report a couple weeks ago, I'm sure you saw it, saying that well over a year in advance, these hacker teams at the GRU and in another, they actually mentioned 3 APTs, or advanced persistent threats, and within those 3 agencies, even subgroups, so 6 APTs, right? And at least 8 malware families. But these are busy all the time collecting information, and that's part of life, right? As the troops are amassing on the border, the web defacements become visible, right? So in Ukrainian, in Polish, and in Russian, there's a lot of web defacements against Ukrainian government infrastructure in January and February, warning, right, of a threat, right, to Ukraine. And you could say, well, as the attacks get more serious, you as a defender, and that's why, you know, on your network security teams, it's good to have a traditional intelligence analyst, right? So who is not just doing hacking or anti-hacking, but who can read the newspaper every day and kind of be aware of what's happening in the world that might bring malware your way. Okay, so about 10 days before the actual invasion, and the invasion took place on February 24th, DDoS attacks. And these are sort of maybe the aerial suppression sort of analogy in cyber attacks, right? The bombers or the jet fighters are, trying to take out the missiles, trying to take out the air defense, et cetera. So about 10 days before, and specifically focused on the Ukrainian government, DDoS attacks, which according to the Ukrainian government were the largest it had ever seen. So these are meant to probably intimidate as well, but also to confuse, to raise the amount of fog in war. Then on the 23rd of February and the 24th of February, there were new wipers that were seen, right? And these are like maybe artillery, right? So if you're reading the news now in eastern Ukraine, artillery will come in for a while, right? And try and kill and frighten everyone. And then the troops will try and advance, right? So you can think about the wipers, when these coming in on the 23rd of February and the 24th of February, and you're familiar, I guess, from 2017 with NotPetya attack, right? That's a wiper. I come in, I wipe your data, and then I destroy the boot record on your computer. So all of a sudden, your computer sitting here is a paperweight, right? Can't really do anything with it. Actually, an expert has to come in and rebuild your computer, rebuild the data, right? And that takes time and effort. So that's, things are probably getting serious if your agency or your institution or your country is under attack by a wiper. And then, as the troops cross the border, we see psychological operations start. And before I describe that in any more detail, I'll just say that I just have one slide on each of these, DDoS, computer wiping, and psychological operations. So this is the intelligence headquarters in Kiev. And I was super lucky, as a foreigner there. I lived just to the left of this building, and then the university is just to the right of this building. If you know Kiev, you know what I'm talking about. And so I got to live on this street, and enjoy beautiful Maidan and beautiful Kiev, and thank goodness that it hasn't been destroyed, right, during this war, because it's a beautiful historic city. And you might not even know this, but just maybe behind, a little on the right, is the opera. And the opera in 1917 is where Kerensky, the Russian politician, was murdered in 1917 as the Bolshevik Revolution was taking hold in St. Petersburg. So a very famous street, and intimately tied with Russian politics, 100 years ago as it is today. But in the DDoS, what you can see is these are really focused on Ukrainian government, right? Again, largest DDoS ever for 10 days. And attribution, or saying who's responsible for an attack, is often very slow and tedious and uncertain. I was in Estonia in 2007, and still, even to this day, who did it, right? It's still a whodunit, really, sort of episode of all those DDoS attacks, because, Estonia will say, it was Russia, But there's been no conviction, no arrest, et cetera. You see my point. In this case, on February 18th, the White House came out with a report at a briefing at the White House. Jen Psaki, right? She said, known technical GRU infrastructure we have associated with this attack. In other words, attribution is Russian, not just Russia, but Russian military intelligence, right? So that's important. So I have two candidates for the biggest hack in this war, right? And so this is the first one. On February 24th, now we know that this hack took place 1 hour before Russian troops crossed the border. 1 hour, right? So again, one of your, if y'all do analysis on malware, even in a tactical sense, one of your best friends is a timeline, right? So start putting together a timeline of what you see on your network, right? It just, detected malware here, detected malware here. What can you coordinate or correlate with those events that happened in, VIP travel or the installation of new product line or something like that at your company? In any case, 1 hour before Russian troops crossed the border, Viasat, via malicious firmware update, which is another huge indicator, right? Red flag, saying that these hackers, whoever it is, really know what they're doing, right? Malicious firmware update affects user modems across Europe, all the way from Ukraine to Morocco. So this is similar to NotPetya, right? With so much collateral damage around. But 1 hour before the troops crossed the border, satellite modems in Ukraine, unusable, bricked. So again, these things have to be physically replaced by Viasat, right? So according to the Ukrainian government, this was a huge comms loss. And just on May 10th, so a couple of days ago, the United States government published a report, the UK government, as well as the EU, saying this was Russia, and saying that it was targeting Russian military command and control, right? So a very specific attack against a strategic target. And if you listen to what the Ukrainians are saying, this had a major impact on defending the country. So candidate number one, right, for strategic cyber war attack with potentially decisive, right? Hopefully, from the attacker's perspective, decisive impact. So here's a little bit more on the wipers. What I want to say here is that you want allies in cyberspace, right? So think about it. When you have Microsoft and ESET and many, many others coming to your defense, right? So in this fight, Ukraine has not been alone. I think there's a common understanding of who the aggressor is in this fight, and there have been so many people to stand up and support Ukraine in various ways. So in this case, you can see ESET, Slovakian company, I think based in San Diego now, basically coming out, with an important report on the day of, in this case, prior to the attack, and then explaining in detail not only the indicators of compromise and the type of attack, but also how to best defend against it. So psychological operations kind of came in as the troops crossed the border. And look at this. So it can be pinpoint propaganda, pinpoint targeting of victims and targets. So in this case, soldiers might get a text that says, swap sides. One of them, she's the woman in this photo, she's holding up a machine, and it says that when the snow melts, they will find your body in the snow, right? So they're meant to frighten, intimidate, etc. Soldiers received that. Citizens received something different. Citizens received, hey, did you know that the ATMs in the country are not working? Right? So this is, again, causing panic. This is the thing from Estonia in 2007. The biggest single aspect, I think, to that attack was that the banking infrastructure was knocked offline for a couple of hours. Right? So then the question is could a couple of hours have been a couple of days or a couple of weeks? And then how long does it take before you have a national security crisis on your hands if people can't, as the Estonians put it, buy, eggs and bread? Government workers were receiving yet another message that asked them to switch their allegiance from Ukraine to Russia, right? So that obviously has not happened. I think, the Russians vastly overestimated their appeal, especially among Russian speakers. Turns out Russian is just a language, right? It is not a political allegiance. We can see hacked social media and TV, hacked Ukrainian military Facebook accounts of senior leaders asking the troops to surrender. Zelensky asking the country to surrender in a deepfake, right? So these are operations that are, the attacker at least hopes are going to have a strategic impact. And one of the things that you can do is try and educate your citizens, your employees, about deepfakes and about information operations. Here is candidate number 2 for biggest hack of the war, at least thus far, right? So here you can see, you've got Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And one of the things, this is pretty strategic, I think, that in 2020, when a young woman, Tikhanovskaya, won the election, right, in Belarus, but was forced out of the country, and basically the pro-democracy movement, their own Maidan, was suppressed with violence and torture. Belarus then had to submit to Russia in a way that it hadn't previously. And so Russia was going to use Belarus to send troops and war materiel into Ukraine via these rail networks, right? So the thing about hacking, is especially tactically, it works, right? The question is whether you can achieve some kind of strategic effect. So in this case, it looked like it may have been an amalgam of hackers and spies, defectors, and we know that in Belarus, there's a lot of anti-Lukashenko sympathy, right? So they want change. We know that in Belarus, came out in the streets in their millions in 2020. So it takes a team, right? In this case, there was also Windows XP. that was being used by the signal cabinets on the railways. So at the beginning of the war, hackers and people on the ground tried to slow this equipment and to disrupt the railway networks. And it's one of those questions, how, was it decisive? Was it a strategic hack? Maybe. But there's belief that it contributed to the 40-mile convoy north of Kiev. In other words, the difficulty of putting troops and materiel into what was the ultimate goal at the beginning of this war was, take over the capital and kick out Zelensky and put in a puppet leader. And then all those trucks and tanks became sitting ducks, right, for the attackers. And so this is a candidate for the biggest, or the most strategic or impactful hack of the war so far. So, you could pick any of these dots and sort of drill into it. But I do think Ukraine is benefiting from an incredible level of connectivity and sympathy. So I think so far in the war, we can say that information operations have outshined simple info ops, have outshined complex computer hacking so far. It's an incredible amount of connectivity. So think about it. We are still in the Azov Steel plant with these soldiers that are underground fighting the Russians, still to this day. We still have connectivity with them. They're still sending out videos, and their family members are still communicating with them via video chat. After all of these attacks and bombardments every day, strategic bombing against this facility. So connectivity is incredibly important and maybe even decisive, ultimately, right? I mean, in other words, you can hack my computer. Yeah, it works, but I'm going to grab another device or a friend's device, or my telephone. And so in Ukraine, among the things that are happening are any Ukrainian civilian can use any telecommunications network right now for free, right? You don't have to subscribe to anything or have any money. As long as you've got a smartphone, you have connectivity. And this has led things to like Zelensky being able to talk to parliaments around the world in tailored speeches, asking for money and asking for weapons. Despite constant bombardment, if you can't stop that, you're going to have trouble as an attacker. So what else? So the United States they have a Shields Up website, which has intelligence, updates on the war, best practices in computer security relative to the conflict, etc. The EU has had cyber forces in there because the EU, you may or may not know, is trying to have its own security apparatus, right? NATO, I'm sort of associated with the NATO Cyber Center or think tank there in Estonia. Well, guess who the latest member is? Actually, that's not true. The latest member last week is South Korea. But prior to that, it was Ukraine a few weeks ago, right? And so if you look at the number of members, I think it's about 30 now. I'm super fortunate. I was the first researcher ever posted there in 2007, a year before it even opened. I helped to build the place for the Pentagon. And now we're up to 30 members. Let's talk about lone hackers, anonymous, right? Anonymous contributing in its own way, right? Anonymous coming out, tweeting, we are fighting on behalf of the Ukrainian government. Distributed denial of secrets, right? Over 6 million documents have been posted to the web that have been stolen from the Russian government. 500,000 from the body in Russia that manages censorship and manages control of RUNET, right? So not only IT firms, but IT sec firms basically coming out. And this is a tough environment for Russia to operate in. And I think it may be one reason why we haven't seen this dramatic cyber attack from Moscow. Is because, well, where are they going to start, right? So I recently moved from Africa to Brazil. Just before we moved, we were on Safari Park, and we followed for about an hour a lion. And the lion was circling this huge group of zebra and wildebeest that were all in a tightly packed formation looking outward. And this poor lion was just circling for about an hour and then finally just wandered off into the jungle. There was nowhere for the lion to attack. It was one of the most interesting things I've ever seen. So in the same way, I think one of the biggest stories of the war so far has been the united nature of the Western response, right, to what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. And that's in the traditional battlefield space as well as in cyberspace. But if you think, so some of the big stories, like from China, for example, there was a story of Russia getting hacked from Western infrastructure, but at least according to the authors of the article, it was in fact Chinese hackers. They're taking advantage of the situation, right, to target Russia from making it look like a Western attack. So what you want, I think, are allies. And the broader point I want to make is, and this applies whether you're in your company or in your home or in your nation, cyberspace is kind of, the strength of it is in community. And the strength of it is in working with, maybe researchers or allies that you don't even know, right? And so it's just, it's a similarity of philosophy. You want to take advantage of the power of the web to succeed. So at the mid-war assessment, I do think that this information operations and connectivity are key. If you want to survive conflict, if you want to succeed, right? Denial of service attacks work. Computer espionage works. All of these exploits can be arrayed against vulnerabilities in an effective way. But if you can't stop this, you can't stop. Ultimately, your goal is strategic in this case, for sure. And you want to achieve. And so just like those three main kinds of cyber attack, I think theft, denial, and manipulation, the biggest one by far is connectivity, is access, is bandwidth, is saying your piece. And then even if you get knocked offline, guess what? I'm going to appear over here. And that's the way censorship works as well. In your country, you can try and censor information, and people are going to go around it and find some other way to communicate, some other way to collaborate. And that's, of course, what the web is all about, right? One of the stories about the founding of the web is it was meant to be a way to survive nuclear war, a way to survive an attack by an aggressor. So just a couple of slides on what's happening at NATO, because I think this helps to provide some information, perhaps if you don't know it, but also some guidance, right, in terms of advice and best practices. So NATO has said that cyberspace is a domain of military operations, right? It's a space that we are going to defend the same as land, air, and sea. This is important, right? Because what's happened so far in the war, Putin wanted to diminish NATO, and instead it's getting twice as big for Moscow, right? Because Finland is so long, right, that it's now the border, Russia's border with NATO has grown to immensely. Cybersecurity is a core task of collective defense for the alliance. International law applies in cyberspace. So NATO is saying we don't need any new law for cyberspace. We already have international law about sovereignty and about promotion of rule of law, etc. This applies in cyberspace. Let's figure out how it translates. One of the strengths is diversity and a defensive philosophy. And again, this is good. I think that dictatorships are very fragile politically, but they're also fragile in cyberspace, because I can say this is the way, this is the only one true way, but I've got so many people who are going to say something that I don't expect, from an angle that I don't expect, from at a time that I don't expect. And then the strategic partner with the European Union is critical because cyberspace, of course, relies on technology and firms and citizens and non-governmental organizations, et cetera. And so there's a political side to it that you have to work in tandem. And so NATO and the EU, if you look at their literature, are working ever more closely on cyber. And some of the tactics that are happening, okay, how do you take these strategic guidelines and implement them in the right way? Each of the nations of NATO has pledged to understand information security, to promote information security within their space. One place I've lived is Luxembourg, and Luxembourg only has about 300 traditional soldiers, right? But because of the banking sector there, they would have many thousands, actually, of information security personnel, right? So think about that, and that makes, all of a sudden, Luxembourg also just joined the NATO Center in Estonia. But places like Iceland, Estonia, these small countries can actually have a big impact in the cyber domain where everything can be quite asymmetric, right? Even one person, creating Wikipedia, because thinking this idea might work, changes the world, right? So then in order to deconflict, if you've ever been in government, this word deconfliction is kind of important. Your agency and my agency need to at least coordinate on what we're doing. The United States is not very good at that. But in this case, the NATO Cyberspace Operations Center is supposed to deconflict cyber operations that countries may be running, right? Malware information sharing platform, a partnership with industry, you get the idea. It's how do you implement these things in practice? And here on the right, this picture is locked shields. So I presented at Black Hat DEF CON, I think, well over 10 years ago on the first effort to do locked shields. And that's when, 15 years ago, we were just in the sauna having a vodka, talking about how cool it would be to, connect a couple of computers together and to hack and defend, right? Today, locked shields is well over 2,000 people working on it every year. And maybe 50 blue teams, huge red team, and incredible. And if you're interested, you can actually, participate at some level as well. You can apply to be a part of a blue team, for example, that defends against, and is very critical infrastructure focused. Even back then, in 2010, we had all these scale models of dams and factories, and they actually had fireworks on the back. And the ultimate prize, if the hackers could figure it out, was to actually blow up the little models that had fireworks on them. So here's an example, and I think this is my last slide, but it's just an example of what the NATO Cyber Center is putting out. Maybe 1,000 publications by now, because it's been around for 15 years. And I can say, because I was the first researcher there, I just want to give props to Black Hat. I submitted a talk to Black Hat in 2008, Black Hat Tokyo. It was called Cyberspace and the Changing Nature of Warfare. And it got accepted. And so I flew from Estonia to Tokyo to give it. And it became the first document, it still is if you sort by time on this NATO Cyber Center library. I'm lucky enough to have the very first publication. And it was at Black Hat, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. But this is one of the latest, or it's about a year old or so. But it is the result of many nations and many actually private firms as well, and consulting firms. And so it's a kind of example of a strategic product. If you want to think about your country, if you're working on behalf of Singapore, a lot of the things that you need to think about, from the strategic to the tactical. So that's my talk. Thank you so much. We're out of time. I don't know if I can take a question or not, but I'll definitely be around for a little while if you want to chat about these things. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be here, and hope to see you again. Thank you very much.